At 2:50 p.m. on April 4, 1943, 25 consolidated B-24D Liberator bombers lifted off from Salouche Field near Benghazi, Libya, heading north across the Mediterranean Sea toward Naples, Italy. Their mission? Bomb the harbor facilities and cripple Axis supply lines. Among those aircraft was a brand new B-24D, serial number 41-24301, with the name Lady Be Good hand-painted on her nose. She carried a crew of 9 young men, all on their very first combat mission. By midnight, 24 of those bombers had safely returned to base, but Lady Be Good never came home. Search and rescue teams scoured the Mediterranean for days, finding nothing. The aircraft and her 9 crew members were declared missing in action, presumed lost at sea. Their families grieved. Their names were added to the long list of war casualties. And the mystery of what happened to Lady Be Good seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. But 15 years later, in November 1958, a British oil exploration team flying over the vast Libyan desert spotted something impossible: the wreckage of an American bomber, sitting nearly intact in the middle of the Sahara, 440 miles inland from the coast. When investigators reached the crash site in 1959, they found something even more astonishing. The aircraft was perfectly preserved. The machine guns still worked. The radio still functioned. Containers of water were still full. And inside the aircraft, they found a navigator's log, personal diaries, and clues that would eventually reveal one of the most haunting stories of survival and brotherhood in World War II history. This is the story of Lady Be Good, not just the story of how a bomber got lost, but the story of 9 young men who survived a crash landing, walked together through one of the harshest deserts on Earth, and left behind a testament to courage, friendship, and the human will to survive against impossible odds. It's a story that remained hidden for 16 years, and it's a story that almost nobody tells today. But to understand what happened to Lady Be Good and her crew, we need to start at the beginning, with 9 young men who never imagined their first combat mission would also be their last. The crew of Lady Be Good were fresh arrivals to the war. They had reached Libya just 2.5 weeks earlier, on March 18, 1943. The aircraft herself was brand new, assigned to the 514th Bomb Squadron, 376th Bomb Group, on March 25th. Pilot First Lieutenant William J. Hatton, age 24, from Whitestone, New York, was the aircraft commander. Co-pilot Second Lieutenant Robert F. Toner, age 22, from North Attleboro, Massachusetts, sat beside him. Navigator Second Lieutenant D.P. Hayes, age 23, from Lee's Summit, Missouri, was responsible for getting them to the target and home again. Bombardier Second Lieutenant John S. Waravka, age 25, from Cleveland, Ohio, would aim and release their bombs. The enlisted crew were equally young. Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant Harold J. Ripslinger, age 30, from Saginaw, Michigan, the oldest man aboard, maintained the aircraft's 4 Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engines. Radio operator Technical Sergeant Robert E. Lamott, age 20, from Lake Linden, Michigan, handled communications. The 3 gunners, Staff Sergeants Guy E. Shelley, Vernon L. Moore, and Samuel E. Adams, manned the defensive weapons. 13 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns that gave the B-24 its reputation as a flying fortress. These 9 men had trained together, flown practice missions together, learned to trust each other with their lives. But April 4, 1943, would be their baptism by fire, their first real mission against the enemy. None of them knew it would also be their last flight together. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was one of the most important American bombers of World War II. At 67 feet long, with a 110-foot wingspan. It was a massive aircraft, powered by 4 engines, producing 1,200 horsepower each. Maximum speed, 290 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 28,000 feet. Range, 2,100 miles with a 5,000-pound bomb load. It could carry 10 crew members and defend itself from any angle with its 13 machine guns. Lady Be Good was a B-24D model, one of 2,738 built. She was reliable, powerful, and proven in combat. But she had 2 critical vulnerabilities that would prove fatal on April 4. She required precise navigation to find her way home in darkness, and her fuel capacity, while impressive, was finite. If the crew got lost and flew too far, the engines would eventually starve and die. And in the desert, there was no second chance. The mission briefing on the morning of April 4 was straightforward. 25 B-24s would fly in formation to Naples, bomb the harbor at high altitude, and return to Libya before dawn. The weather forecast was concerning. Strong winds and sandstorms across North Africa, but not unusual. The crews were confident. They had trained for this. They were ready. Lady Be Good took off at 2:50 p.m., one of the last aircraft to depart. As she climbed away from Saluch Field, her crew could see a massive sandstorm rolling across the desert. The wind was fierce. Visibility was poor. But Lieutenant Hatton kept climbing, pushing through the turbulence, following the other bombers toward the Mediterranean. What happened next would seal their fate. The sandstorm forced several aircraft to turn back. 8 bombers aborted the mission and returned safely to base. But Lady Be Good continued, her engines ingesting sand, her propellers fighting the wind. Lieutenant Hatton made the decision to press on. His crew was depending on him. The mission was important. They would not turn back on their first combat flight. But the powerful winds had scattered the formation. By the time Lady Be Good reached Naples at 7:50 p.m., flying at 25,000 feet, the other bombers had already attacked and departed. The target was obscured by clouds and smoke. Visibility was nearly zero. Lieutenant Hatton faced a decision: drop their bombs blind and risk hitting civilians, or abort the bombing and save the ordnance for another day. He chose to abort. Lady Be Good turned for home, her bomb bay still full, jettisoning the explosives into the Mediterranean Sea to reduce weight and save fuel for the long flight back to Libya. Now came the critical part: navigation. Getting to Naples had been relatively simple: follow the formation. But returning, alone, at night, through clouds, with strong winds pushing them off course, required precise instrument flying and dead-reckoning navigation. Lieutenant Hayes, the navigator, worked his charts and calculations by flashlight, trying to account for wind drift, airspeed, and time elapsed. Lieutenant Hatton flew on instruments, trusting his navigator to guide them home. At 12:12 a.m. on April 5th, Lieutenant Hatton radioed Saluch Field with a message that revealed their growing concern. "My automatic direction finder is not working. Can you give me a heading to base?" The automatic direction finder, the ADF, was a radio navigation aid that could home in on radio beacons from the airfield. Without it, the crew was relying entirely on dead reckoning and visual navigation. But it was night. They were flying above clouds, and without the ADF, they had no way to know if they were on course or hopelessly lost. Saluch Field received the message and attempted to provide a directional reading using high-frequency direction-finding equipment. They gave Lady Be Good a bearing of 330 degrees from Benina, meaning the aircraft should fly northwest to reach the coast and the airfield. But here's where the tragedy deepened. Lieutenant Hayes, working in the dark nose of the bomber with limited information, may have misinterpreted the reading. Instead of realizing they had already overflown the coast and were heading south into the desert, He may have believed they were still over the Mediterranean, heading north toward Libya. This navigational error, taking a reciprocal reading, a 180-degree mistake, is one of the most common and deadly errors a navigator can make. And in the darkness, with no visual references, no working ADF, and no way to confirm their position, Lieutenant Hayes had no way to know he was wrong. Lady Be Good continued flying south, deeper into the Sahara Desert, away from safety, away from base, away from any chance of rescue. For 2 more hours, Lady Be Good flew on. The crew must have been confused, anxious, wondering why they hadn't reached the coast. They should have seen flares from the airfield. They should have seen the Mediterranean. But there was nothing below them but darkness. Unknown to them, Saluch Field had fired recognition flares, trying to guide them home. But Lady Be Good was already 150 miles past the coast, flying south at 200 miles per hour, burning fuel with every passing minute. At approximately 2 a.m., the engines began to sputter. The fuel gauges showed empty. They had been airborne for over 11 hours. They had flown nearly 1,600 miles, and they were in the middle of the Libyan desert, 440 miles from their base, with no fuel left and no chance of reaching safety. Lieutenant Hatton gave the order, "Bail out, all crew to abandon aircraft." It was the hardest decision a pilot can make, to give up on his aircraft and trust parachutes to save his men. But there was no choice. The engines were dying. The aircraft would soon fall from the sky. Their only chance was to jump and hope for rescue. 8 of the 9 crew members successfully abandoned Lady Be Good that night. One by one, they jumped from the hatches, falling through the darkness toward the unseen desert below. Their parachutes opened. They descended, and they landed hard on the sand and gravel of the Sahara. But one man never made it. Bombardier Lieutenant John Waravka, age 25, jumped last. His parachute failed to fully deploy. He fell 4,000 feet and hit the ground at terminal velocity. He died instantly. The other 8 crew members, scattered across several miles of desert, never found him. They fired flares. They shouted his name. But John Waravka was already gone, his body lying alone in the darkness. After the crew bailed out, Lady Be Good continued flying on autopilot. For 16 more miles, with nobody aboard, the ghost ship glided south through the night, gradually losing altitude, descending in a shallow glide, until finally the last drops of fuel were consumed, and the bomber settled onto the desert floor in a remarkably gentle belly landing. The impact was so controlled that the aircraft remained largely intact, skidding 700 yards before coming to rest in 2 pieces in the Kalanshio sand sea. Lady Be Good would sit there, undisturbed, for the next 15 years. But the story of her crew was only beginning. 8 young men, alone in the Sahara Desert, with limited water, no food, no idea where they were, and no way to signal for help. What happened next would test every ounce of their training, their courage, and their brotherhood. And it would ultimately reveal something extraordinary about the human spirit. When the 8 survivors gathered at dawn on April 5th, they took stock of their situation. They had landed in flat, featureless desert, gravel plains stretching to the horizon in every direction. No vegetation, no water, no landmarks. The temperature during the day would exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, it would drop below freezing. They had 1 half-gallon canteen of water between them, a few candy bars, no shelter, and no way to know that rescue teams were searching 440 miles to the north, looking for them in the Mediterranean Sea. But they had each other, and they had leadership. Lieutenant Hatton, the pilot, took command. He gathered the men and made a plan. They believed, incorrectly, that they had bailed out over the Mediterranean and drifted inland only a short distance. They thought the coast was perhaps 20 or 30 miles to the north. If they walked north, they would reach the sea, find help, and survive. It was a reasonable assumption based on what they knew. It was also, tragically, wrong. The 8 men began walking north at first light on April 5th. They walked in formation, maintaining military discipline even in crisis. They shared the single canteen of water equally, each man taking only small sips to make it last. They marked their path by leaving behind equipment, parachute fabric, Mae West life vests, pieces of their flight suits, so search and rescue teams could follow their trail. They walked for 8 days, through gravel plains and sand dunes, through temperatures that ranged from below freezing at night to over 120 degrees during the day. They rationed the water until it was gone. They ate nothing. There was no food in the desert. They kept walking because to stop meant death. They kept together because survival meant brotherhood. No man would be left behind. Co-pilot Lieutenant Robert Toner kept a diary. In cramped handwriting, using a pencil stub, he documented their ordeal, day by day. His entries are some of the most haunting documents of World War II. They show men facing certain death with courage, humor, and an unbreakable bond of friendship. April 5th. 8 of us gathered. Hazel still missing. No one found him. Water very scarce. April 6. Still heading north. Good march in morning. Blistered. Sun very hot. April 7. Rested at 11:30. Sun very warm. Rested until 5. Walked until 8. April 8. Hit sand dunes. Very miserable. Good wind but continuous blowing of sand. Everyone very weak. Can't get very far. Prayers all the time. Again, our only hope. April 9. Shelley, Rip, Moore, separate and try to go for help. No more water. Still going north. This entry marks a critical decision. 3 men, Staff Sergeants Guy Shelley, Harold Ripslinger, and Vernon Moore, volunteered to go ahead, moving faster to try to reach help while the other 5 rested. They were the strongest. They thought they could make better time. They promised to send back rescue. The 5 remaining men, Lieutenants Hatton, Toner, and Hayes, and Sergeants Lamott and Adams, stayed together, moving more slowly, conserving what little strength they had left. April 10. Still having prayer meetings. Again, everyone very weak. Eyes bad from sun. Tried to sleep again in shade if possible. April 11. Hayes and Adams went ahead. No word back. Can't get very far. Now, even the 5-man group was splitting up. 2 more men tried to push ahead. 3 remained behind. The fellowship was breaking down not from conflict, but from desperation. Each man doing what he thought would give someone a chance to survive. April 12. The final entry. Lieutenant Toner's last words. No help yet. All very weak. Can't get very far. Still praying. That was the last entry. Lieutenant Robert Toner, age 22, died that day or the next. He was 85 miles north of where they had landed. He had walked farther than most people could imagine walking in a comfortable environment, let alone the Sahara Desert without food or water. But it wasn't far enough. The coast was still 355 miles away. One by one, the others died too. Some made it farther than Toner. Staff Sergeant Harold Ripslinger, the oldest crew member at 30, walked farther than anyone, 109 miles from the landing site. But eventually, even he succumbed. His body was found with his jacket wrapped around his head for sun protection, suggesting he fought to survive until his body simply could not continue. All 8 men who survived the bailout died in the desert between April 5th and April 13, 1943. They were never more than 109 miles from where they landed, not even 1/4 of the distance to the coast. They had walked in the right direction. They had done everything right, given the information they had. But they were doomed from the moment Lady Be Good's navigation went wrong over Naples. They just didn't know it yet. For 15 years, Lady Be Good and her crew lay undiscovered in the Libyan desert. Search and rescue teams had looked for them in 1943, but in the wrong place, over the Mediterranean, where everyone assumed the aircraft had gone down. No one imagined a bomber could fly 440 miles inland and crash land intact in the desert. It seemed impossible. But on November 9, 1958, a British petroleum oil exploration team, flying over the Kalanshio Sand Sea, spotted something that shouldn't exist: the wreckage of an aircraft sitting in the middle of nowhere. They reported it to authorities at Wheelus Air Base, but initially, no one investigated. There were no records of any aircraft lost in that area. It seemed like a mistake. Finally, in March 1959, a ground team reached the crash site. What they found astounded them. Lady Be Good was broken in 2 pieces, but otherwise remarkably preserved. The desert's dry environment had prevented rust and decay. The aircraft looked like it had crashed weeks ago, not 16 years. And inside, they found evidence that told an incredible story. The machine guns still worked. Investigators test-fired one successfully. The radio still functioned when powered. Food rations were intact and edible. A thermos of tea was still drinkable. The aircraft's logbook, navigator's charts, and personal effects were all preserved. And most haunting of all, there were no bodies aboard. The crew had bailed out. They might still be alive somewhere. The discovery of Lady Be Good made international headlines. The U.S. Air Force launched an immediate search for the crew. They knew now that 8 men had survived the crash. They had bailed out. They had landed safely. Where were they? In February 1960, 14 months after finding the aircraft, searchers made a grim discovery. The remains of 5 crew members, Lieutenants Hatton, Toner, and Hayes, and Sergeants Lamotte and Adams, were found together, 85 miles north of the crash site. With them were their personal effects, including Lieutenant Toner's diary, which told the story of their 8-day walk through hell. Further searches located 3 more crew members. Staff Sergeants Shelley, Ripslinger, and Moore were found scattered farther north, having pushed ahead to try to reach help. The farthest, Sergeant Ripslinger, had made it 109 miles before his body gave out. Only one crew member was never found during the official searches: Bombardier Lieutenant John Warovka, whose parachute had failed. In 1953, a British desert patrol had found human remains in the area, but hadn't reported them as possibly related to Lady Be Good. In 2001, forensic analysis of photographs from that 1953 discovery suggested those remains might have been Warovka's, but by then it was too late to confirm. 8 of the 9 crew members of Lady Be Good were eventually recovered and given full military honors. They were buried in American military cemeteries with their names, ranks, and the notation that they had died serving their country. Their families, who had waited 17 years for answers, finally had closure. The story of Lady Be Good raises profound questions that still haunt military historians today. How could a trained crew get so lost? How could they fly 440 miles past their base without realizing it? And how could they survive a crash landing only to die walking in the right direction, never knowing they were too far from help to have any chance? The answers reveal both the limitations of 1943 technology and the cruel indifference of the desert. Without the automatic direction finder, the crew was navigating by dead reckoning, calculating position based on airspeed, heading, and elapsed time. But strong winds had pushed them off course throughout the mission. By the time they turned for home, they were already south of where they thought they were. Lieutenant Hayes, working in the dark with limited instruments, made a reciprocal error when interpreting the radio bearing from Saluch Field. Instead of realizing they were south of the coast, he thought they were still over the Mediterranean, heading north. This single navigational error sent Lady Be Good flying south into the desert for 2 more hours, covering another 400 miles before the fuel ran out. When the crew bailed out and walked north, they were walking toward a coast that was 440 miles away, an impossible distance to cover on foot in the Sahara with no water. But what makes the story of Lady Be Good so powerful isn't the navigation failure. It's what happened after. 8 young men, facing certain death, walked together. They supported each other. They shared their one canteen of water equally. They maintained military discipline and organization, even as their bodies broke down. They prayed together. They kept each other's spirits up. And when some men were stronger, they volunteered to go ahead to try to save the others. Lieutenant Toner's diary shows no panic, no recrimination, no blame. Just determination, brotherhood, and faith. Even on April 12th, as he wrote his final entry, knowing he was dying, his words weren't complaints or regrets. They were simply, still praying. That's the lesson of Lady Be Good. Not how to avoid getting lost, but how to face death with dignity, courage, and love for your brothers. Those 8 men could have scattered, each trying to save himself. Instead, they stayed together as long as possible. They helped each other. They died together. And because Lieutenant Toner had the strength to keep a diary, their story survived to inspire future generations. Today, the wreckage of Lady Be Good is gone. Parts were salvaged in the 1960s for use in other aircraft. The major components were moved to a Libyan Air Force base in 1994. But pieces of Lady Be Good are displayed in museums around the world, including the National Museum of the United States Air Force. Lieutenant Toner's diary is preserved as a national treasure, and the story of 9 young men on their first combat mission continues to be told. So here's my question for you. If you were Lieutenant Hatton on April 5, 1943, standing in the desert with 7 other men, knowing you were lost, knowing you might die, what would you have done? Would you have maintained discipline and hope as they did? Would you have walked 85 miles through the Sahara, believing rescue was just over the next dune? Would you have kept a diary so someone might learn your story? The crew of Lady Be Good showed us that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about facing the worst circumstances imaginable and still choosing to help others, to maintain hope, to move forward one step at a time. They didn't survive, but they faced death together, with honor and dignity, never abandoning each other. That's brotherhood. That's sacrifice. That's what makes their story worth remembering. Lady Be Good. Lost on her first mission. Found 16 years later, preserved by the desert as a time capsule of 1943. Her crew walked farther than most of us could imagine, through conditions none of us could survive, never giving up hope. They didn't make it home, but their story did. And it reminds us that even in the worst failures, navigation gone wrong, fuel exhausted, lost in the desert, the human spirit can still shine through. So tell me, would you have had the courage to walk those 85 miles? To keep hoping when hope seemed impossible? To support your brothers knowing you were all going to die? Leave your answer in the comments, because the story of Lady Be Good isn't just history. It's a challenge to all of us. When everything goes wrong, when all hope seems lost, will we face it with the same courage and brotherhood that those 9 young men showed in April 1943? That's why we remember them, not because they survived, but because of how they faced death, together, with faith, and with the unbreakable bond of brotherhood that defined the greatest generation. Lady Be Good and her crew, lost in 1943, found in 1958, remembered forever.